Okay, recording has begun.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. I would like to call this regular Planning Commission meeting of April 26th, 2021 to order. Madam Secretary, can we all stand for the Pledge of Allegiance? And Ali, would you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Absolutely. Please stand and put your right hand over your heart. Ready, begin.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Ali. Madam Secretary, please call roll.
Okay, roll call. Commissioner Alderete.
Here.
Commissioner Calderon.
Present.
Vice Chair Morrissey.
Here.
Vice Chair Morrissey.
I'm here.
Thank you. Commissioner Pham. Commissioner Pham, you're muted.
Bao, can you hear us?
I'm here. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
That's okay. Thank you. Commissioner Ramos.
Present.
Thank you. Commissioner Wu.
Here.
Thank you. Chair McLaughlin,
Here.
you have quorum.
Thank you very much. I would now like to invite the Commission Secretary to describe the way the public can access this virtual meeting.
Thank you, Chair. This meeting is being live streamed via our portal at www.santa-ana.primegov.com/public/portal and to YouTube at www.youtube.com/City of Santa Ana videos/live. If you would like to provide a public comment, you may do so in the following ways. Join the meeting via Zoom. Enter meeting ID 958-495-84523. When the item that you would like to comment on is being discussed, select the hand icon to let us know you'd like to speak. You will be called upon by the name you entered. You can also call 669-900-9128. Enter meeting ID 958-495-84523. When the item that you would like to comment on is being discussed, press *9 to let us know that you'd like to speak. You will be called upon by the last 3 digits of your phone number. After you are called upon, please press *6 to unmute yourself. You will have 3 minutes to speak, and I will alert you when your time is up. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Moving on to public comments on non-agenda items. Madam Secretary, do we have anyone that wishes to speak on a non-agenda item this evening?
If you'd like to speak on a non-agenda item, please either select the hand icon or dial *9 now. We'll wait a few seconds.
We're getting feedback, Madam Secretary.
Just one moment. Okay, we've fixed that. Just going to wait a couple more seconds, see if we have any callers. We don't have any callers for non-agenda items.
Thank you. Hearing none, we will close the public comments for non-agenda items and we'll move on to the consent calendar. Is there a motion to approve the minutes of the meeting from April 12th?
I have a comment.
You have a comment, Tom? Thomas, go ahead.
Yeah, I had asked for a, I don't see it recorded. I had asked for a future agenda item to discuss, I think it was policy for requiring plan check review when we renew old CUPs.
Right, yes.
Commissioner Morrissey, the minutes are action minutes of the actions that the Planning Commission took that evening. Your comment was noted and and staff is working on that request.
Okay. So yeah, I guess that was another question is, do we normally record those in the minutes or if they're just in the meeting recording? So that answers my question. Thank you.
Okay, then do we have a motion to approve the minutes from April 12th?
This is Alan. I move.
Thank you, Alan. Do we have a second?
I'll second it.
And that's Calderon?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, we have a motion and a second. Madam Secretary, please do a roll call vote.
Yes, roll call vote. Commissioner Alderete,
Yes.
Commissioner Calderon,
Aye.
Vice Chair Morrissey,
Aye.
Commissioner Pham.
Aye.
Commissioner Ramos,
Aye.
Commissioner Wu,
Aye.
and Chair McLaughlin.
Aye.
Motion passes by unanimous consent.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Since all of the commissioners are here in the meeting today, we do not have to have any excused commissioners. Therefore, we'll move on to, basically, this is the end of the consent calendar. We'll now move to public hearings. Before we do that, I'd like to review protocol. Public hearing protocols. Staff will provide a presentation and answer questions from the commission. The public hearing will then be open. The applicant will be given the opportunity to speak, limited to 15 minutes. Members of the public will be given the opportunity to comment, limited to 5 minutes. The applicant will be given an opportunity to respond to comments made by the public, limited to 5 minutes. The public hearing will then be closed. Discussion will return to the commission for formal action taken to approve, conditionally approve, deny, or continue review of an application. Please consider the following suggestions when organizing your comments. Please state your name and address. Please state your name and address. State whether you support, oppose, or are neutral to the proposal. Your statement should include pertinent facts within your knowledge. Avoid gossip, emotion, repetition. A clear, concise, non-repetitive argument is most effective. This is the time and place for the public hearing on item number 3 for the property located at 2106 North Tustin Avenue. Please note the applicant has requested this matter to be continued to the next meeting. Do we have a motion to continue this item?
Chair McLaughlin, I'd like to recuse myself from this item.
Okay. That's fine.
So moved. Commissioner Alderete.
Already so moved. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Second by Mr. Morrissey. Madam Secretary, we do a vote, roll call vote. And we are recusing Commissioner Ramos.
Yes, thank you. Commissioner Alderete,
Yes.
Commissioner Calderon,
Aye.
Vice Chair Morrissey,
Aye.
Commissioner Pham,
Aye.
Commissioner Wu,
Aye.
Chair McLaughlin.
Aye.
Motion passes by majority vote with Commissioner Ramos abstaining.
Okay.
Chair, if I can make a quick note, Commissioner
Yes, sir.
Ramos did share her reason for abstaining at the previous meeting. I just want to note that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Ma'am, would it be helpful if I state that again? Should I
That's
state
okay.
that?
I just want to acknowledge that you did say it before, so.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we'll move on to item 4. This is the time and place for the public hearing on, excuse me.
$400 East 17th Street, Chair.
Yeah, but this is, okay. This is the time and place for the public hearing on item number 3 for the property located at 400 East 17th Street. Please note the decision on this matter is final unless appealed within 10 days of any interested individual or party. Before we begin, do any of the commissioners have anything that they wish to disclose with regards to this item? Commissioner Alderedi?
None.
Commissioner Calderon?
Nothing to disclose.
Commissioner Morrissey?
Nothing to disclose.
Commissioner Fan?
Nothing to disclose.
Commissioner Ramos?
I have nothing to disclose.
Commissioner Wu?
Nothing to disclose except getting gas sometime and a certification for smog.
Okay, thank you. I have nothing to disclose at this time myself. So with that, we'll let staff do the presentation on this item. Giselle Enriquez, you are joining us for the first time. You are joining us for the first time at the Planning Commission. Welcome.
Thank you,
Please tell us-
Chairman.
Tell us about this item.
Yes, good evening, members of Planning Commission. Up for discussion tonight is the application request for conditional use permit number 2021-05, located at 400 East 17th Street. Applicant is requesting to approve after-hour operations at an existing Chevron gas station. Please note there will be no sale of alcohol at the property. The applicant will also be remodeling the site by removing the automobile service bay to expand the convenience store area, which triggered the need for this application. To the right is an aerial image of the location of the subject site. The existing Chevron gas station is located at the southeast corner of 17 and French Street. The subject property's general plan designation is general commercial and is zoned as community commercial. It is surrounded by commercial uses at the north and west, office use at the south, and the Penway and 5 freeway at the east. This is an existing site photo indicating the location of the gas station. The site is approximately 24,000 square feet. The windows that you see here with the grid is the location of the existing service bay, which has been vacant for the past 2 years. For context, the site was developed with a service station in conjunction with a retail and auto service in 1968. It has been operating 24 hours, 7 days a week since its opening. And in December 2019, the applicant filed a request to expand the retail area of the convenience store into the existing service bay. Therefore, pursuant to Santa Ana Municipal Code Section 41-681, the proposed expansion necessitates the need for a CUP to continue the after-hours operation. This is a site plan of the subject site. The image shows the proposed expansion of the convenience store located at the rear of the property. Along the edges of the property, you can also find existing landscape and parking spaces as well as the rear of the site plan. The image before you shows the existing floor plan in which the convenience store area is less than half in comparison to the service bay. This floor plan shows the layout of the proposed expansion, which includes an increase of sales area with a bathroom, remodel, office, and utility space. The following is the proposed elevation, which is facing 17th Street. The surface wall of the elevation will be removed to provide new windows, a tower element, and brick veneer throughout the front elevation, and overall storefront finishes. To summarize, the existing convenience store operates 24 hours, and its proposed expansion will continue to provide convenient service to residents and visitors of the area. The site is also buffered from sensitive land uses by commercial and office buildings. The conditions of approval and standards in the Santa Ana Municipal Code will address any potential negative impacts. Therefore, the police department is satisfied with the conditions of approval and does not oppose the granting of a CUP. In addition to that, the property maintenance agreement will ensure the property remains compliant with Santa Ana Municipal Code requirements and will maintain a sound condition. I also want to emphasize again that the project is not proposing any sales of alcohol. Pursuant to the California Environmental Quality Act, the projects categorically exempt Section 15301, Class 1 existing facility of the CEQA guidelines. An environmental review number 2021-23 will be filed for this project with the county. There is no fiscal impact associated with the project. Staff recommends approval of the to adopt a resolution approving conditional use permit 2021-05 as condition. This concludes staff's presentation. I'm available to answer any questions.
Thank you, Gazelle. Nice job. Thank you. Do the commissioners have any questions that they would like to ask of staff at this point in time? Commissioner Alderete?
I have none.
Commissioner Calderon?
No questions.
Commissioner Morrissey, Vice Chair Morrissey?
No questions.
Commissioner Fan?
No question.
Commissioner Ramos?
No questions at this time.
Commissioner Wu?
No questions.
Okay, I have no questions at this point in time. Once again, Gazelle, thank you. Madam Secretary, have we received any written communication on this item?
We have not received any written communication on this item.
Okay, thank you. We will now open the public hearing. Would the applicant like to speak on this matter? Is the applicant here?
The applicant is on the line. Applicant,
Okay.
please go ahead.
Yes, I am. This is Alex Cuevas with AGC Design Concept. We are the architectural engineering company who is proposing this change to the site. As Giselle noted, the Lou Bays, they have been closed for 2 years, and the convenience store they have right now is too small to service the public. Therefore, that's our request in the 24 hours.
Okay,
And I wanted to emphasize that our client is not going to sell any alcohol.
okay, thank you. Do you have anything else you'd like to comment on?
No, if you have any question related to the design or the footprint, I'm here to ask any question, answer any questions.
Okay, I'll go through the commissioners. Commissioner Alderete, any questions of the applicant?
I have none.
Commissioner Calderon, any questions of the applicant?
No questions.
Vice Chair Morrissey?
No questions. Thank you.
Commissioner Fan?
No questions.
Commissioner Ramos?
No questions.
Commissioner Wu?
No questions.
I have none myself. Having no questions, Madam Secretary, do we have anybody from the public that would like to comment at this point in time?
If you'd like to comment on this item, please select the hand icon, or if you're calling in, press *9. We'll wait 30 seconds to see if we have anyone that would like to speak on this item.
None?
Okay, time's up. We do not have any callers.
Okay, would the applicant like to make any final comments or?
No, that will be it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. With that, the public hearing is now closed. Does the commission have any final questions of staff? Or would they like to make a motion at this point in time? Eric?
Sure. I'll make a motion that we adopt a resolution approving PUP number 2021-05 as conditioned.
This
Okay,
Commissioner
thank-
Wu, I second it.
Okay, thank you. We have a motion and a second. Any other comments or questions that anybody would like to make at this point in time? Hearing none, we have a motion from Commissioner Alderetti and a second from Commissioner Wu. Madam Secretary, will you do a roll call vote?
Yes, Commissioner Alderetti,
Yes.
Commissioner Calderon,
Aye.
Vice Chair Morrissey,
Aye.
Commissioner Pham.
Aye.
Commissioner Ramos,
Aye.
Commissioner Wu,
Aye.
Chair McLaughlin.
Aye.
Motion passes by unanimous consent.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Good luck. We'll now move on to item number 5, which is the zoning ordinance, number 2021-02. Please note the recommendation of this matter will be forwarded to the City Council at a later date for final determination. Before we begin, do any of the commissioners have anything they wish to disclose on this matter? Commissioner Alderetti,
I have nothing to disclose.
Commissioner Calderon,
Nothing to disclose.
Vice Chair Morrissey,
Nothing to disclose.
Commissioner Ramos, Commissioner Fan,
Nothing to disclose.
Commissioner Ramos,
Nothing to disclose.
Commissioner Wu.
Nothing disclosed that I can anticipate at this time, but because of the change of languages, it affects future, and I don't know what's ahead.
Okay. Thank you. I have nothing to disclose. Madam Secretary, did we receive any written communication on this item?
We did not
Sorry.
receive any written communication.
Okay, so with that, Ali, are you prepared for your presentation?
Thank you, Chairman. This evening, Jerry will lead the first part. I'll lead the second part.
Okay,
Good evening, Chairman and Commissioners. Item number 3 is a proposed zoning ordinance amendment by staff to amend several sections of Chapter 41 of the Santa Ana Municipal Code regarding lodging-related land uses and reasonable accommodation citywide. Moving on to the next slide. Just to give the Commission some background, the reasoning for this proposed amendment. Over the years, the city has experienced a rise in the number of group living arrangements or other type of group homes within single-family residential neighborhoods, which has resulted in an increase in code enforcement complaints and police calls for service. Outdated definitions and the reasonable accommodation process require updating to reflect the current state and federal laws and to implement best practices. Moving on to the next slide. There are several federal and state laws dealing with housing, which the city must comply with, which include the Fair Housing Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the California Fair Employment and Housing Act, and the Lanterman Development Disabilities Act. These laws basically prohibit discrimination against individuals on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, national origin, family status, and disability through zoning and other land use practices. Moving on to the next slide. With that being said, there are basically 2 types of facilities. There are those that are licensed by the state, and then there are those that are unlicensed by the state. Just to give you some background, in 1973, the state basically enacted the Community Care Facilities Act, which established a statewide system of community care facilities for persons with mental and developmental disabilities and socially dependable children and adults. Based on that, the state did provide a more or less framework for licensed facilities that are providing care for certain people with disabilities. Those are the licensed facilities. The unlicensed facilities include boarding houses or group homes. In addition, they also include fraternity or sorority houses, and can sometimes also include sober living facilities as well as single housekeeping units. Licensed facilities are those that are either licensed by the Department of Social Service, the Department of Healthcare Services, or the Public Health Department. Those are the three different agencies or the regulatory agencies that are in charge of either regulating or licensing these type of facilities. And then the ones that are licensed do not require any review by the state or by local jurisdictions. Moving on to the next slide. So based on the framework that the state provides, there are small licensed facilities. Those are those facilities that are 6 or fewer. And then there are those that are large facilities, which are 7 or more individuals. Based on state law as well as federal government regulations, facilities of 6 or less individuals cannot be regulated by cities. In addition to that, cities cannot regulate single housekeeping units. However, cities can regulate boarding houses. Moving on to the next slide. Now I'll go ahead and pass it over to my colleague, Ali.
Thanks, Jerry. Good evening, Commission. So to provide additional framework and background for these types of facilities in Santa Ana, the zoning code currently is silent in many ways in regards to group homes, and many of the definitions that address congregate living or associated lodging or related definitions are antiquated or out of date. Also, a review of state and local records has shown that there are approximately 113 group homes currently operating in Santa Ana, group homes being a collective term for many of these types of facilities. 72 of those facilities have been found to be licensed, while 41 are unlicensed. Since 2016, just for additional background, the Code Enforcement Division has received 50 complaints associated with these types of uses. And again, the information that we presented in the slide is based on state and local records. The map before you on this slide is a heat map showing the density of residential care facilities in residential zones. So when viewing this map, the cooler colors like blue indicate less concentrated areas, whereas the bolder colors like red and orange and yellow indicate the more heavily concentrated facilities in certain areas of the city. So as a verbal overview to this slide, one can see that in the western sector of the city in Riverview West, there's a large concentration, as well as concentrations in the mid-city area and in the northeastern part of the city. This is the 113 facilities that we spoke about in the previous slide. On this subsequent slide, one can see the community care facility density. So in addition to those 113 facilities, there's additional facilities that may be commercial and industrial that provide community care in commercial zones operating as a business. So one can see a higher concentration of these types of facilities throughout the city when adding these types of uses to the map. So to address the city's out-of-date ordinances and definitions, the city is proposing to delete, update, and establish new definitions relating to lodging-related land uses, again, collectively known as group homes, and lodging-related land use arrangements. As a complementary measure to this effort, the city is proposing approval of a separate ordinance amendment for city council consideration that would reenact the reasonable accommodations ordinance by removing it from the zoning code and adding it to chapter 1 of the Santa Ana Municipal Code as a sort of general item that's cross-agency. The reasonable accommodations ordinance, as I said, will be part of that chapter 1 amendment in ordinance amendment number 2020-1. That was included in your staff report packet to provide a comprehensive overview of the city's efforts to address the antiquated reasonable accommodations ordinance and group homes definitions. But tonight, the Planning Commission is authorized to make a recommendation on zoning ordinance amendment 2021-02, which updates the definitions in the zoning code and would delete the reasonable accommodations ordinance from the zoning code. So in analyzing this request, the reason for all this that's being asked of the commission tonight is multifaceted. First, the goal and analysis of this effort is to provide greater clarity within the Santa Ana Municipal Code through updated definitions relating to lodging-related accommodations and arrangements, as well as an updated reasonable accommodations ordinance. The current reasonable accommodations ordinance is housed within the zoning code and addresses accommodation requests that are related to land use and zoning practices, but it's better practice in many cases to house this ordinance in outside of the zoning code so that I can conserve cross-agency features as well, such as requests for blue curbs being painted in front of one's residence or place of business, for example, which is not ordinarily a land use or zoning matter. Secondly, the effort would no longer define which land uses are permitted based on disability or disability status. Instead, it would regulate the type of housing. Basically, if one were to operate a licensed care facility with 6 or less, the city, as in any other city or county jurisdiction, would be preempted from having any local regulations and would basically be required to allow such uses. But any other type of housing, like let's say unlicensed facilities or larger facilities that are unlicensed, could be and are proposed to be defined as a boarding house, which the state does allow local agencies to regulate and count as a boarding house and enact restrictions in their zoning code. Thirdly, the efforts would improve the Code Enforcement Division's ability to evaluate and respond to related complaints. With outdated definitions and practices in the zoning code, such current status hampers the Code Enforcement Division's ability to effectively evaluate these complaints to determine whether or not they're in compliance with local or state laws. So this effort is also meant to enhance the Code Enforcement Division's ability to respond to these complaints. And lastly, for context, in Orange County, several other cities have adopted this approach to updating their reasonable accommodation ordinance and their definitions surrounding these sort of group home arrangements. These include some of our neighbors to the south in Aliso Viejo, Lake Forest, San Clemente, and San Juan Capistrano. Lastly, and most importantly, the reasonable accommodations ordinance will maintain its ability to provide flexibility through the reasonable accommodation application process, wherein one could continue to submit requests for reasonable accommodations for housing type or for non-land use matters, and help us fulfill that requirement of state law. So as with any other project, this effort has been evaluated pursuant to the CEQA guidelines and pursuant to sections 15060, C2 and C3 subsections. The effort has been deemed exempt, so an environmental review will be filed for the project, and there's no fiscal impact associated with this effort. So based on these analyses and the information presented tonight, staff is recommending that the Planning Commission recommend that the City Council approve ZOA number 2021-02. And again, for reference, the separate ordinance amendment that was included for reference in the packet will be considered by the City Council at a future date as well in a complementary manner to this effort. So with that, our presentation is concluded, and we'd be happy to answer any questions the commissioners may have at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, Ali. We'll move on to questions. Commissioner Alderete, any questions of staff?
Yeah, I think it's more a, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay.
Yes.
So I think I'm really, I think the presentation, but I feel like I don't really understand what we're trying to do with this ordinance and the issue or issues we're trying to address. I read through staff's report. I read the Goldfarb and Lippman analysis, which is a law firm that's well known in sort of in this area and in representing nonprofits and cities in litigation. And And I have to say, after I read their analysis, I'm still a little bit confused because it's complicated. And so I wanted to know from staff, what is it that we're trying to solve? Is this an affordability problem? Is this a larger healthcare problem where people don't have healthcare, so they're trying to come to some sort of residential facility for rehab? Because what I've heard is there's 50 complaints in 4.5 years. While that's significant, I don't know what those complaints are about. Those could be a eggshell plaintiff type of neighbor, or they could be issues of parking, but I really don't know. So perhaps maybe you could answer that question. What is the issue that we're trying to solve here?
Thank you, Commissioner.
Who's speaking?
Go ahead, please.
Oh, Ali, I'm sorry. I was talking over you. Forgive me.
No, I'm done. That's my initial question.
John, are you commenting, or is Ali or Jerry commenting?
I will, but I certainly don't want to interrupt Ali. And I think he was talking at the same time. So whatever he prefers.
Okay, Ali?
Thank you, Commissioner. Above all, the goal is to make sure that the Santa Ana Municipal Code is always containing provisions and definitions that are in accordance with the latest state and federal laws that address these topical areas. So the main effort here tonight that's being asked before you is to adopt an ordinance that would update or delete or modernize definitions concerning congregate living. There are presently many different types of definitions in the zoning code that address this topical area. So it's time essentially to bring those up to latest definitions, and also where deleting rely on the state definitions for these things. Secondly, the effort with the reasonable accommodation ordinance is to also implement best practices of relocating that outside of a zoning code into a more general section of a city's code, in order to not make it just a land use matter, make it more of a general cross-agency reasonable accommodations process. And then also going back to the analysis slides, another goal of this effort is to essentially enable the city to more effectively categorize and evaluate and respond to group living arrangements that are operating or that wish to operate in the city of Santa Ana. Because at present, with the current definitions and current use provisions in the residential zoning district and in some of the commercial zoning districts, some of them simply are just listed in a manner that's out of date or no longer compliant with state law, or essentially just needing updating. So it's a multifaceted effort, but they're all related in that essentially by modernizing certain sections, we can more clearly establish what is permitted by the Santa Ana Municipal Code with group living arrangements. And then also, if one were to seek flexibility in those provisions, they could submit an application for a reasonable accommodation request to be evaluated by the city on a case-by-case basis and appropriately responded to.
Okay, so that's helpful. So this is sort of for people that, or organizations or homes that want an exception to the process. We've got an iterative process that we go through to see if we can approve them or not. Is that right?
I'm not sure if I would categorize it as iterative, which implies kind of learning as you go. The goal here is to have a clear, concise ordinance and a clear, concise complementary application that would be transparent enough that one could know what to submit for an application to seek that sort of evaluation on a case-by-case basis. But yes, more or less, Commissioner, you're correct.
Okay, so, and then this is my last question for now. So are there any other cities that are similar to Santa Ana that have updated their code in this way? Because the ones that are listed don't have a lot in common with Santa Ana. The needs in the city are different. The population's different. I think most of those cities are bedroom communities, and they don't have the density that we have, or the amenities. I'll just throw that out there. But I wonder if say Oakland or Anaheim has adopted anything.
So Commissioner, thank you. The ones that we know for sure are the ones that were listed in the PowerPoint that you're referencing. Some of them, well, let me reapproach that question. We did make contact with planners and staff from every single one of those cities to get a sense of what situation they were facing as well. And many of them did face a proliferation that was relative to the scale of their city. And so from what we understand, they adopted similar approaches because rather than regulating based on disability type, which some of our neighboring cities have attempted, they're regulating based on housing type and licensure, which is supported by state and federal law and I believe case law as well. And John, if you'd like to supplement that with anything, please feel free.
Yes, thank you, Ali. There's not much more to what Ali said. He said it very nicely and very comprehensively. But Commissioner Alderete, to your question, the chief advantage of this proposed amendment is that it regulates congregate living, group living situations on a facially neutral basis. Where cities have gotten into trouble is when they choose or they seek to regulate types of group living homes, say, for example, sober living homes, on the basis of disability, or when they target them specifically. Some examples in this area are Costa Mesa and Newport Beach that you may be familiar with. Costa Mesa, for example, has spent the last couple of years defending its sober living ordinance, $7 million. They did achieve a victory at the trial court level, but is now on appeal. Legally speaking, the much more principal approach is to regulate congregate living on this facially neutral basis. And the upshot of this amendment would be that the city would, as Ali said, continue to group homes that are licensed or that consist of disabled residents. Those must be permitted by state law. Anything else would be what is called a boarding house under the definition of the new ordinance, and prohibited, that is, the operator applies for and seeks a reasonable accommodation under the state and federal disability laws. And as Ali noted, that allows the city the flexibility, to provide relief from our restrictions where that is appropriate. So it's really the facial basis that is the premise of the ordinance. That is the legally speaking one of the chief advantages.
Got it. Okay. All right. Thank you for that explanation. That's helpful. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Commissioner Alderete, any other questions?
No.
Commissioner Calderon.
Sorry, can we move forward with Commissioner Ramos and Commissioner Wu's questions? They have their hands raised. I'll think of a question right after. Thank you.
Commissioner Ramos.
Thank you, Chairman McLaughlin, and thank you, Commissioner Calderon. Like Commissioner Alderete, I'm also confused, so I have several questions for clarification. What are we considering a group home? So per the ordinance language, I've circled the section that defines what is considered to be a boarding house, which from what I'm understanding is any housing situation where there's 2 or more individuals that have signed individual leases and don't have one lease for the property as a whole. So I'll give a scenario. If there's a 4-bedroom house in Santa Ana and I rent a room there because that's what I can afford, and I have a lease of my own for that room, and then there's 2 other individuals in that house that also have their individual lease, and then the landlord lives in another room, is that house now considered a boarding house with this ordinance if recommended by the Planning Commission, approved by the City Council?
Commissioner, thank you. So per the draft definition of boarding house that's before you this evening, the definition largely, to answer your question, would essentially define a boarding house as one where the occupants are subject to separate lease agreements. Now, it is important to draw a distinction in several cases here just for illustrative purposes. So if there's a landlord that is leasing out their entire residence to a single group under one lease, then that would not be a boarding house. But if we had one landlord or a facility operator leasing out separate bedrooms subject to separate lease agreements individually with each occupant of those bedrooms, for example, then that would be considered a boarding house. What would not be considered a boarding house would be, let's say, an individual who owns a single family residence, for example, and has an extra bedroom and decides to sublet out one bedroom to make some supplemental income, let's say, that would not kick someone into a boarding house definition. But in one of the examples that you did provide, yes, if you had one landlord or one facility operator that rented out bedrooms as on individual lease or individual contractual agreements, then that, per the draft ordinance before you tonight, would render it a boarding house.
So I know in the presentation that staff has provided tonight, there was a number provided on how many group homes are operating within the city and how many of those are licensed. But if we want to talk about boarding houses with the language that staff is presenting tonight, then that number is not a real one, because in Santa Ana, it is very unaffordable for many families, and many families are getting by renting out a room. So there might be a 3-bedroom home where there are 3 different leases under that roof, because that's the only way that the individuals that live there can afford to stay housed in Santa Ana. And that's the reality. So but if we're gonna be considering this language, then I think we as a commission also need to see, I guess I'm just concerned that the presentation we were provided doesn't reflect the reality of Santa Ana. Because I don't know how the city would even find this data on how many homes there are within Santa Ana where that would now be considered a boarding house if this language is adopted by the city council, and what that would mean for those families. So I have concerns there, and I'm wondering what would happen in that case if this language is adopted, or is code enforcement then going to be tasked with trying to identify these homes, and what would happen in those cases? And I know that, like any other item that is presented, the staff report includes information on how this aligns with the city's strategic goals. But as I'm thinking about the city of Santa Ana and what the city is currently doing, which is providing an emergency rental assistance program, where individuals that rent out individual rooms that have a lease are able to access those funds. How does this impact those families? I'm thinking we'd go from having families that need an emergency rental assistance to maybe having families that will need emergency housing because they're going to be homeless if code enforcement will be trying to then shut down these boarding, I think those are the languages, boarding houses, when in reality it's been the only housing that these families have had access to in Santa Ana for a very long time. And I speak from personal experience growing up in Santa Ana, and growing up, my family rented out rooms in homes like this. And it was the norm, and it continues to be the norm for many families that aren't able to pay for housing just for their family. So I'm wondering how staff thought about those things.
Thank you, Commissioner. Yeah. Thank you, Commissioner, for your question. And as it relates to your question about code enforcement, generally, our code enforcement process is one that is a complaint-based. Based on the list that we have, we would need to be revisiting those only when we get complaints, in terms of what we get and receive, and we would evaluate on a case-by-case basis whether or not they fall under our definition and would need to be regulated. As it relates to your discussion about the housing component and the living arrangement for different families, while certainly that could sound very similar to what we're doing here, I think we will need to evaluate further on how that could be addressed or could not be addressed as a part of this. It is a good question, and is one that I think we need to look further.
Thank you. Thank you for that response. And I have a couple more questions.
Go ahead.
I'll ask one more now. Just on the complaints.
Ask what you want.
Thank you. On the complaint, so I know Commissioner Alderete also mentioned this, but I'm wondering if we have more information on the nature of complaints and information on where these complaints originated. So I'm wondering if we have ward-specific data, and if Alvaro Nunez is not present today, I'm wondering if he can be present at a future meeting to show us what these complaints look like. I'm also wondering if complaints have we've seen a rise in them in the last year or so. I know the data's for the last 4.5 years, and it's 50 complaints. So I'm wondering if those 50 came in the last 2 years or if they've been evenly spread out.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Commissioner. We do have a detailed list of the nature of the complaints. Some of that is not information that's often publicly available to protect the complainant's privacy, but in general, just a verbal summary of it, and many of the complaints do center on either sober living facilities or transitional living facilities. And although there are several from 2016, many of them begin in 2017, 2018, 2019. But based on the data, the majority are not necessarily from like the past year. They're more evenly spread out over like a 3 or 4 year period. And again, they mostly center on sober living and transitional living facilities.
Thank you. And then I'll just say one last thing, and then I'll give the other commissioners a chance to also ask questions and provide comments. But also just thinking back to code enforcement. So I know code enforcement has a lot of duties, and one of those I feel is the most important is ensuring that the state's health and safety code is being upheld by landlords, especially in our apartments and throughout Santana. And I fear that with the language as it is now, that I don't think is taking into consideration the living arrangements of many families in need of affordable housing. I fear that this type of language would actually discourage some of the families that need code enforcement to inspect their units the most. I fear that it would discourage them from allowing that and from fostering that relationship. And I know code enforcement isn't here tonight, but I worked with them in the past, and I think they could speak to how difficult it is sometimes to enforce the health and safety code, because families are fearful of letting code enforcement into their units because they fear retaliation. And I think code enforcement plays a very important role in making sure that Santana has decent habitable living conditions for its residents. So I would also just like us to remember that role of code enforcement's job, upholding the health and safety code and not just enforcing ordinances. And I'll let fellow Commissioner Alan Wu go now. I know he had his hand raised up after me.
Okay, Commissioner Wu.
My question is similar to Yuri's, but from a different perspective. I'm trying to see how, when issues come up from the community in terms of complaints, and how do we use your ordinance in order to apply approving something or not approving, or determining. And because it's simplified and stripped down somewhat, it brings a whole host of issues that concern folks in the community. Let me put aside the disabilities that houses that are licensed, because licensed, they're going to be regulated by state health and welfare and all that. That's fine. It's the unlicensed use of providing similar service that we have complained the most about from the community. And that comes up because we call the police when there's disturbance, fight, or whatever. But we have a use that is culturally reflective of people in the community. And I'll talk about my own Asian community. It's not unusual for us to sponsor relatives to get them out of China, or someone from the extended family because they live in the village and we know them. And we sponsor them to come over. So they stay with us until they get a job, they get rooted, they get their own place. I don't know if you call that a group home, because their family or or extended family come from the same village in Toisan, okay? And to us, that's kind of important because our roots in America comes on the back of those that went ahead of us. But let me give you some scenarios that I like question how to apply this ordinance. Let's say I want to set up a brothel, okay? And I got girls working for me and I don't cause any trouble. The police will never see us. Am I operating illegal? And I know this sounds ridiculous and all that, but am I operating illegal? And how would this ordinance affect that? Then let me give you another scenario. Let's say I want to set up a commune, okay? And it's a commune, artists, musicians, and all that. We live under one house. Is that a group living? Then to Yuri's point, I see more the widow having extra room, the children have moved out, she rents out her house to help continue to pay the mortgage. I'm concerned about impacting them, okay? But at the same time, providing them with some safety and protection as well. So in our community, because of the economic status, the immigrant cultural value, that's one thing to do with housing. And I'm not sure if the stripped down ordinance will impact them adversely. I think it's more likely the unregulated sober living facility, without naming them in particular, because that will end us in a lawsuit. But I think it's those problem kinds of property that we need some guidance more about going without being a detriment to the housing because of low economic status. So I don't know if I'm clear in that. And then there's the kind of unwanted by any community adverse social activity like a brothel or other kind of housing thing that becomes like a fraternity party house, you know. So that's in a nutshell of me seeking more clarity in the language of how to impact this. The licensed facilities seem to be clear, and I have no problem with complying with ADA, fair housing, and all that. It's the unlicensed part, because you remove so much of the language, that concerns me. And then protection for the economic use of housing in terms of group living situation, that I think Yuri is absolutely right, that in a city like Santa Ana, it's not going to be like Mission Viejo, Lake Forest, and those communities where they just don't want something in their community, you know?
Alan, can you put your statements together into a question that Ali can answer?
I think the question is what is it in the changes that will provide the three protections, you know, the protection of trouble unlicensed facilities. And then the third thing, allow for group home situation, because we're also on the state mandate to provide more housing to people for homeless prevention, you know. So I would like to, you know, the old boarding houses with Mrs. Jones, you know, cooking fried chicken, has always existed in the community in good time and bad time, especially during the Depression, you know. And you know, the troops from vaudeville stayed at a boarding house, you know, with Miss McGillicuddy, you know. So, you know, I think that we don't want to lose that, okay? But we do need, I don't know what it is that you allow and you don't allow.
Ali, does that help you?
It does, thank you. So I'll break down the question to a couple of answers. Thank you, Chairman and Commissioner. The first one, if I heard there was a question about how does this affect brothels? And my understanding is brothels are not permitted uses in most cities in California, including Santa Ana. So we're not trying to legalize that they'll remain prohibited in Santa Ana. The second one is about sponsorships, like, for example, individuals coming from overseas. You know, the intent of the ordinance is to not necessarily be looking at each subtype of these categories per se, but look at the type of housing. So for the definition of boarding house that's proposed, Commissioner, the definition would be a facility or a house that's a dwelling basically that's rented out to 2 or more separate lease agreement holders. So hypothetically, let's say my family were sponsoring a relative from Iran to come to the United States. If it were one individual and they were staying in a bedroom and we were not charging them rent, then it would be a non-issue. If we were charging them rent through a contractual agreement, then per this boarding house definition, that would still be permitted because it's still just one individual or one group. But the moment it turns into two or more is when it would trigger the boarding house definition. And I think the same sort of logic would apply in response to your question about the communes as well. So I hope that can provide some clarity, and I apologize if I didn't get everything. I'm happy to repeat. So
that's a trigger is a lease. Is that a signed lease or unsigned lease? Because most of the living situation, I think, don't have leases. They're word of mouth agreement.
Correct. So the boarding house definition that's proposed in the ordinance would mention rental agreements, leases or subleases, either written, oral, or implied, when the occupants are not operating as a single housekeeping unit.
And when you do that, are you going to require that they take out a business license now to pay business tax?
Anytime a house is rented out for income, when the entire structure is rented out, a business license is required. In the event that an individual is renting out one bedroom or let's say one area of their house for a separate sublease or lease, I don't believe the city requires a business license for that. In the event that one is renting out 2 or more areas to 2 or more agreements or leases, that would be prohibited per the proposed boarding house definition.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Commissioner.
All right, Commissioner Fan, would you like to ask any questions to staff?
Yes, I think personally, I appreciate the spirit of the language, because I don't think it's malicious. I think it's aimed towards kind of the future of development and kind of the future control of land use in the city. But I also understand the kind of the humane aspect of there are families currently that are in living situations that might be affected by the new language change. So I'm wondering, I know, Ali, you mentioned it before that for, let's say, single family houses that want to kind of comply with the new language, that there is a road to compliance. Is that correct? We're not changing the language so that to deter density or to deter kind of affordable housing, but rather to update for future usage, and then also to kind of we're also offering a kind of a way for these facilities to become compliant with the new language change. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah, the existing and the proposed reestablished reasonable accommodations ordinance would continue to further the goal of providing flexibility in the event that one could document disability that calls for that sort of flexibility from the zoning ordinance standards.
And then kind of in line with the examples that's been mentioned before, where there's a single family house that is currently being subleased with 3 separate tenants, then the remedy to that situation to make it compliant would be just for the landlord to apply for a business license, pay the applicable taxes, and then those families will be unaffected. Is that correct? To be compliant with the new language.
To be compliant with the new language, the individuals in that situation would have to be operating as a single housekeeping unit in order to avoid being seen as a boarding house. So in terms of as it's written before the commission tonight, the proposed language would say that anything that is subject to 2 or more rental agreements or leases or subleases would be considered a boarding house. Whether the city would go after or investigate or review those situations that are not necessarily operating as, for example, like a care facility or a sober living facility, that's something that we would need to discuss further, that perhaps Executive Director Tai could comment on.
So as regards to the enforcement, as I mentioned previously, it is something that we would need to address based on a case-by-case basis as we get the complaints. We're not necessarily going back on past complaints and start investigating them, but rather moving forward, we'll have to review on a case-by-case basis because we are, in essence, having to follow federal Fair Housing Act, and really can't target any specific type of housing unless we get a specific complaint.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate because I know, when you have a single family house, there's only a limited parking, and when you start adding tenants, I think that it affects parking, it affects other things that's related to the property that is not very good. And I'm not sure that what we're discussing now is a changing language, but if it's appropriate to explore kind of a more concrete method of assessing situations where the current tenants and current residents of Santa Ana, they'll feel comfortable knowing that their living situation isn't in jeopardy, and if it is non-compliant, that there is a clearly documented process to either ask for consideration, rather than, I know it's hard right now to really be concrete, but I think that it would be beneficial, kind of in good faith, to have something more concrete and kind of published for residents to kind of know that their living situation is somewhat protected, even though they know that they're not going to be compliant in the future once or if the resolution is adopted. Is that a possibility?
Definitely, that is certainly something you can look into, as I do have the notes on your comments.
That's it for me. Thank you.
Okay, Commissioner Calderon.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, commissioners. Everyone brought really good questions and really good points. I just wanted to make I have like 2 questions that I wanted to ask just for clarification purposes. So just to clarify, this, what we're discussing right now, are we allowing basically like a neutral platform, platform where non-licensed and licensed agent, I guess, businesses or individuals can basically rent out their spaces in their homes, correct? Licensed and unlicensed?
The ordinance would set up a platform or at least would enable the city to be compliant with state law, where if you're a licensed facility and state law already addresses that and says you have to be allowed in a residential zone, then the city would match that and be complimentary of it. But if, as per state law, if you're unlicensed, then there's nothing that obligates a local city to have to allow it. So the city's proposal would be to state that only licensed types of facilities would be allowed in those zoning districts.
Got it. Okay, thank you. And then, is there going to be like an oversight on these type of on this plan?
Yes. So the oversight through licensed facilities is provided through the state of California, the various licensing agencies that we had shared in one of the earlier slides, which I'll pull back up for reference. So, for example, Department of Social Services, healthcare services, and public health. These are the three primary agencies at the state level that regulate these uses through the licensure process. So they, in many cases, have their own separation requirements, their own inspections, their own application process. So the city would basically be, as in many other cities, relying on their licensure requirements to allow them in Santa Ana. The unlicensed facilities would essentially be prohibited unless someone were to submit a reasonable accommodation request to indicate why their facility merited review on a case-by-case basis, as we described earlier.
Got it. Okay, just thank you for that clarification there. And then, what was the last question I had? Damn it, what was going to be my last question? I think that those were my two burning questions right now. Yeah, I mean, honestly, like, I'm just kind of giving some background for those who don't know me. I am a social worker, and I worked in numerous types of group homes all over Southern California. I worked with licensed and unlicensed. I've read reports of situations that happen in those group homes. Sometimes they're not even reported. So I'm really hoping to push for the licensing aspect to this, just because it is a very vulnerable population that needs to, be supervised and at all times, So I remember what I was going to ask. So the last thing I wanted to ask is, I know you mentioned earlier that there are reports, basically people have made complaints. Sorry, that's the word I want to use. Complaints on these homes. Can you give us at least a general of like what these complaints look like, or at this time?
I can provide a high-level overview, but there is some confidentiality with certain components of specific code enforcement complaints to protect the privacy of individuals submitting complaints. But by and large, there were exactly 50 complaints registered between calendar years 2016 to present. In addition, like I said earlier, the majority were about transitional facilities where individuals are living before they transition to a more permanent housing situation, or sober living facilities, which is a loose term to describe perhaps drug and alcohol recovery programs. And so beyond that, I'm not sure if I can necessarily give any more specifics just due to the confidentiality requirements, but what I can also highlight, and thanks Jerry, is in the staff report, in the discussion section on the first page, we also did provide a sort of general overview of what specifically these complaints were about. So it wasn't necessarily that there's a sober living facility in my neighborhood. They were specific about items relating to noise, loitering, secondhand smoke, trash and debris, oftentimes being strewn about in the yard or on the street, and then as well as increased parking demand. So just like the volume of cars being parked on a private property, or sometimes on the grass, or just on the street, double parking, things like that. So
are any of these complaints, sorry to interrupt you, are any
Sure.
of these complaints giving any information as to people reporting any type of like sexual allegations? Like, for example, I know that level 4 iHomes house sex offenders. Are any of these reported in the report that you have?
I don't recall seeing that specific topical area in the code enforcement files, and it could also be by virtue of that may not be the nature of what code enforcement investigates and enforces.
Okay. Okay, I have no further questions. Thank you.
Okay, Ali, I've got a few questions, and then we'll come back to the rest of the commission again. I think we've cycled through everybody at least once.
Mark, when you go around, I do have another question about what are we voting on?
Okay, no problem. We can do that. Let me just put a few things
I
out
still
here.
have questions as well.
Okay, yeah. Oh, Tom, I apologize. Commissioner Vice Chair Morrissey, please come up with your questions.
Thank you. I was looking at the map that shows the residential care facility density. Are those all licensed facilities?
Thank you, Vice Chair. No, these are just all facilities that we have record of, licensed or unlicensed.
Because I was wondering about the zoning. Do I understand correctly that these types of facilities are not allowed in R1? I was looking at the R1 allowable uses. It doesn't look like they qualify in R1. So it looks like by adopting this, this isn't overlaid on a zoning map, but it looks like some of these facilities are in R1 areas. So how would that impact?
Sorry, so the question, Vice Chair, is how would the proposed changes affect essentially what we would see in this map after adoption?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. So adoption of the ordinance would result in a requirement that facilities be licensed to operate in Santa Ana, at least the small facilities, 6 or less. That's just going to be based on state law. And then the unlicensed facilities would have 2 options: to either get licensed or to not elect to locate in Santa Ana. Now, through a complaint driven process, so let's say the ordinance gets adopted and goes into effect, and the next day an individual calls and complains about an alleged facility in their neighborhood, then code enforcement would go out, review, and through the due process, investigate, and if there were merit to the complaint, issue a warning and then a citation and all that to bring them into compliance. So hypothetically, that would then result in a change to the map wherein either the facility would choose to get licensed if they could get licensed through the state, or they would cease operations and move out of Santa Ana.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Let me just ask a few questions, Ali. The number was 113, and it was 72 licensed and 41 unlicensed. So just from the basis of that, what's being written up here in this ordinance from a licensed side of it, since that's state controlled, is really just incorporating the language that's required based on the current state's requirements, correct?
Correct.
So what I'm guessing here is, okay, you've updated the documentation, but by satisfying that requirement, you've covered 72 facilities. The unlicensed ones are the ones that we're trying to define. The thing that I find a little bit confusing here is that you mentioned the vast majority of these licensed and unlicensed are drug rehab or transitional homes. But where does board and care homes come into play? Because they have similar requirements, but they're mostly people that have basically no place to go in a rehab center because they're not capable of staying in a rehab center because they're okay, but they're not at their top form. So they go into these board and care facilities, and they'll stay there for quite some time. And most of them are 6 and under. Are they noted in this set of numbers that we're talking about?
So they could be, and it's difficult because not every operator that's unlicensed is voluntarily going to raise its hand to identify itself. So this is based on the best estimates we can gather from our own records and from the state records. What I can say is there are certain types of facilities that are transitional in the manner that you described, Chairman. And if they're licensed, then pursuant to this proposed ordinance, as you stated earlier, then they would be allowed subject to state law. But if they're not licensed and they're operating as a boarding house, essentially, and they're unlicensed, then pursuant to the ordinance, they would either be asked to get licensed or not operate in Santa Ana.
Well, there's one unique...
Or apply for a reasonable accommodation.
Okay. I mean, there's one situation that I ran across in Portola, the Portola neighborhood, and it was essentially 4 homes that were on 2 different streets, but their backyards were connected, and they were all board and care homes. And you could tell that the people that were working there were going from one house to the other house to the other house, which obviously that was a cost-effective way of running these 4 houses at the same time. But 4 houses in a cluster like that, and this was brought to my attention by a number of people who live in that neighborhood. It's not just one house that sits there with a board. It's 2 or 3 homes connected by backyards or by front yards, and they're all owned by the same company. Now, how do you treat that? That in essence, it's 6 and under in a home, but there's really 3 homes that are in that company's brochure or company's portfolio. How do we address that?
So Chairman, I thank you. I think that's a pretty good question, and we've seen it in other cases as well in the city. The long or the short of it is if they're licensed, then they are allowed per state law. But if they're unlicensed and they're basically operating unlicensed and as an integrated facility, as a colloquial term in the manner that you've described, then one way or another, as being unlicensed facilities, the draft ordinance before you would prohibit that type of operation.
So the question that was asked early on in this discussion was, what is the purpose of this zoning ordinance update? I mean, is it then have you stated then is also the reason is to ensure that those facilities that are unlicensed become licensed or go away?
Well, one of the root desires of updating the ordinance is to be compliant with state law, but also give the city the tools that it needs to effectively review and enforce its codes. And so at present, we do have definitions and we do have use definitions in our zoning code that sometimes do address these types of situations and others that we've discussed tonight. But because those definitions are so outdated, or they've been simply rendered ineffective through case law or through sort of interpretations put out by the state of California, that we're unable to effectively review and determine whether these facilities are even allowed in some neighborhoods or in some cases, or whether we even allowed to enforce and investigate complaints that we're getting in some cases, or whether we can provide flexibility in our standards through the reasonable accommodation process. So it's a multifaceted purpose, but it all starts with updating the zoning code and updating the reasonable accommodations ordinance.
I get that, but Tom Morrissey, Vice Chair Morrissey brought up a good point, and it's an R1 neighborhood, and yet the company, because it's not usually an individual, it's a company that owns 3 buildings in a row. Is that how do we consider that from a zoning perspective?
Chair, to answer that question, just go back to reiterate what Ali was mentioning earlier, is that the ordinance is one that will allow the city to have a process to review that. And if they are licensed, then they can be permitted. If they are not licensed, they do have the opportunity to go through the process of a reasonable request by which the city will review what is it they're seeking. But under the ordinance, they would need to do something and not consider or render the city ineffective to regulate our zoning regulations in residential neighborhoods.
Okay. I guess my last question is the regulated side of the house, the 72 that are licensed, they're regulated and handled by the state of California or by the county, however it's set up. The unlicensed, do we have any ability of inspecting or checking the facilities out other than through a code enforcement complaint?
Chair, it would be, as I mentioned previously, is through a code enforcement process. The city does not go out and seek violation on single family uses, and accordingly, we do not go out and seek violations unless we know there's a specific complaint. We can investigate, address them on a case-by-case basis, evaluate their arrangements, and how they fit with our reasonable accommodation.
All right. I'll go back through the list. Commissioner Alderete, any questions?
Yeah, I think this is just more related to code enforcement. So if someone's operating a group home, whether it's licensed or unlicensed, and there's a complaint, then what does code enforcement do? What's the process and the end result? Because what I think it is I think the city files, or maybe it's the city attorney files a notice of violation, take the property owner to court, lien the property, I think, and then ultimately, perhaps the tenants get evicted or the landlord comes in.
No, the first step is for code enforcement to respond to the complaint by conducting their own investigation. If upon investigation they confirm or not confirm the complaint, obviously in the case of an unconfirmed complaint, nothing would be done and no additional enforcement measure would take place or necessary. However, if a situation is confirmed where there is a potential infraction or violation of the code, that infraction is identified, the property owner is advised on the steps that are necessary to go through and gain compliance. And at that point, code enforcement job is actually done. They don't proceed further unless the owner chooses not to either come into compliance or take action to address the violations.
Commissioner Aldereti?
Yeah, I don't have any additional questions.
Okay. Commissioner Calderon?
No questions. Thank you.
Vice Chair Morrissey?
Yeah, I do have, thank you. I do have a follow-up question. I think you might have answered it, but if, we'll say one of these homes is in an R1 zone and they do get licensed, are they allowed to be in that zone? Even though our zoning code doesn't allow those homes in a R1 zone?
Yes, so thank you, Vice Chair. If a facility were to become licensed and it would meet all the state licensure requirements, and state law pretty much either preempts local zoning or our local zoning, let's say, has nothing to say about it, then it would be allowed in that zoning district because there are certain state licensure requirements for cities to allow those types of facilities in residential zones. So the key in your question was licensure, and long story short, yes.
Okay, thank you. So I guess the other question is, if we have an unlicensed facility in R1 zone and there's a complaint and we determine, they're non-compliant. So they have you'd mentioned they can either get licensed or move out of the area or move out of the home or cease operation.
Correct.
How long would they be allowed to stay while they get licensed? How does that?
So the enforcement process is a due process. We do have minimum time requirements for us to issue the notice of violation, allow time for the violator to resolve the issues. In terms of the extent of the timing, it really is depending upon the extenuating situation. Where there are life safety type issues, we act immediately. We don't take those actions very lightly. But where there are more of a land use infractions or other type of issues, we generally provide a little bit longer time for compliance, but not in the case where it's life safety issues is concerned.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Commissioner Fan?
Yes, I'm just wondering, is there an opportunity in kind of how the language is written for exceptions to what's being changed, kind of in terms of, I think the reason why we're changing the language is to kind of update it and be more kind of refined in how we identify these properties. But as currently, because the language is so vague, these property are somewhat compliant, I guess is kind of like not a great way to put it, but there's something particularly non-compliant about them because the wording of the code is a bit vague. So is there an exception where these, whether or not a single family, whether or not it's licensed or unlicensed facilities, they're grandfathered in because currently they're not non-compliant, but if there's any modifications to the property in the future, then they're required to be compliant with the new code language. Is that a possibility, or is that not kind of not the way things work?
This ordinance is an ordinance that applies to the use, and it doesn't really establish a time frame when we do receive a complaint, whether or not the facility is in compliance with our regulations. At that point in time, we would be able to determine whether or not they are compliant with the ordinance. And if they're not, they would be required to, as we mentioned, to take actions to come into compliance or cease their activities.
And Commissioner Fan, I think if I can also just add, I think some of the common themes from some of the commissioners tonight was over concerns about how the boarding house definition as written may affect some living situations by families in Santa Ana communities. And so if that's the nature of your question, then maybe there is an opportunity to examine the draft language that's presented before you tonight and see if it can be further refined to address that concern. So perhaps that's something that we can discuss in further detail after the questions of the other commissioners.
Yeah, I think that would be great because I don't think anyone here is kind of opposed to wanting to make all the properties within the city to be code compliant. Because I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I think that the main concern, from what I understand from other commissioners as well, is that they don't want the change to kind of adversely affect kind of the existing residents who are just kind of looking for a place to live. So I think some clarity in terms of that will kind of help everyone understand that for the most part, the changing language is kind of to promote a more safe and more appropriate land use policy for the city.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Fan. Commissioner Ramos.
Thank you. Yes, I have perhaps a question, a clarification, and then a comment. So my question to clarify is, I know there's been discussion of a road to compliance, and that has been mentioned several times, that there is a way that Santa Ana residents could come into compliance, but I want to clarify, and from my understanding, the only road to compliance would be for families, or would be for individuals that have a disability that are granted reasonable accommodation from state law. They're the only individuals or households that would be able to comply with the language as is if they were to be considered a boarding house or group home.
To answer your question, Commissioner, you are correct. And as we mentioned, that based on your these type of questions, we do have an opportunity to look at some clarification to address those type of situations as well. So that is something that we will need to look at, as we mentioned earlier, as to how we can clarify the process to allow for those type of situations, or to consider those type of situations.
Thank you. And that provides some reassurance. And I want to say now that I would not feel comfortable voting on the language as is tonight, or even voting for staff to amend the language or I wouldn't feel comfortable voting to allow staff to amend and then continue to city council. I would want to see the language before I could vote to recommend it. So for that, because of that, and because I think that there's a lot of unintended consequences that have not been thoroughly thought out, I would feel most comfortable continuing this item, perhaps having a study session for us to understand all of the impacts. I think it would also be helpful to have Alvaro Nunez, who is the executive director, I believe that's his title, if I'm not mistaken, of the code enforcement department, and perhaps Judson Brown as well, who does a lot of the housing work and is with CDA. And I'm asking for them because I think there's been a lot of questions around code enforcement. And I'm also wondering if there's been discussions with CDA and specifically Judson and the staff he works with, because right now they're providing a lot of direct financial emergency rental assistance to families that live in what this language would consider a boarding house. So I just want to ensure that we're facilitating discussion throughout the process. So whatever final language is recommended by this body is one that will be beneficial to all Santa Ana residents, both homeowners and renters that create whatever affordable housing they can. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Commissioner.
Thank you, Commissioner Wu.
My question to Executive Director Tai is this. I'm looking at the package you sent us, Exhibit 1. Exhibit 1 is the ordinance with a lot of stuff crossed out, but we don't know what you're going to replace there. Then Exhibit 2 is an ordinance you're going to be sending to council saying that we're going to update these things because it's out of date and all that, but it doesn't say specifically where you are. Am I correct in assuming the two things, that we really don't know what you're going to be updating when we pass this and forward this to City Council?
No, so the ordinance you have in front of you, zoning ordinance 2021-02, the strike-throughs are the, I'm sorry, I'm getting an echo here. I'm not sure it's mine. The strike-throughs are what is going to be deleted, and the underline is what's going to be added, and the text that are remaining in plain text are the existing text. So what you see there is what is going to be changed in terms of the ordinance. In addition to that, the ordinance is going to kick out the reasonable accommodation language that is currently under the zoning code, and it will then be readopted. So you're not taking any action to adopt the new reasonable ordinance language. That reasonable ordinance language is going to be readopted by the City Council in Chapter 1 as part of this process. That would be the recommendation. But
so in other words, I'm sorry.
What you see in the ordinance that is before you is what is going to be changed.
So in other words, what we've been speculating on is things that will come up during the administrative process as you're looking at each thing. What
Correct.
you did was you just removed certain things and made it easier to address other things, right?
Correct.
Yeah, and I think the comfort level, we know that you guys do a good job, and I really appreciate what staff does in it, but in terms of making a decision, it's sort of like, well, trust us later, you know, and I think that's where the value system of us asking all these questions, especially, I'll speak for myself, that's what I am doing. But now that I understand the strike through and the underlining, that was not clear to me in the beginning, because I would read that over and I was going, what am I sending to council? So thank you for the clarification.
Thank you for your questions and comment.
Thank you, Alan. I guess I'm going to kind of wrap up, I think, unless anybody else has anything to say here. But my question to staff was going to be, what's the timeline on this? And I think what we've just had discussion on through a number of the commissioners is it's not just a timeline, but, you know, we have an update that's being proposed by a number of different comments made tonight. And so if we were to go ahead and say we approve this, when it was written and completed, would it come back to the Planning Commission for review?
As written, no. As written, no.
As written, no. So therefore, then the question is, if we want to review what has been proposed and some of the changes that have been discussed this evening, it would then warrant a continuance.
Chair, what I would recommend at this point based on the healthy discussion that we have today, certainly there's a lot of questions that's been raised and nuances that we want to make sure the commission is completely comfortable with in their recommendations. So we will take this back. We have our notes, and we will come back to you at the next meeting, and hopefully we can address all of these. And if we need to take more time, we will discuss that with you at the next meeting.
So at this point in time, is no action required by the commission because you're going to come back with,
I would recommend that the commission motion to continue the public hearing or continue this discussion to consideration to the next meeting. And we have notes on your questions that we will be working on during that time.
okay, and going back to the timeline question, is there a date time that we're trying to get this ordinance updated and in the hands of the city council?
We would like it as soon as possible, but I think given the question, it would be a good step for us to answer those questions as we move forward.
Okay. I'll go through the commissioners one more time. Commissioner Alderetti, any question, comment?
Yeah, just briefly, I thought that Commissioner Ramos had asked for like a study session. I don't know, you can call it whatever, but I have to tell you, I was, having read the report, I was kind of flummoxed what we were supposed to do with it, and I didn't really understand it. So perhaps we could get a more comprehensive staff report to kind of explain this. I felt like I was just operating on a deficit. So if it's a study session or a continuance, I just want to be able to be more informed.
Okay. Min?
Yes,
Okay,
I would ask for continuance, and we do have a detailed list of questions that has been posed. If there's any additional questions that you have that we can answer now, certainly we would take them. If you have any questions that you think about after this meeting, we certainly be welcoming those questions as well.
Okay, Commissioner Calderon?
No questions, thank you.
Vice Chair Morrissey?
Sorry about that. No questions. Yeah, I appreciate Min suggesting we, and Commissioner Ramos suggesting we take this back and take another look at it. So I have no further questions.
Okay, Commissioner Fan?
No further question.
Commissioner Ramos?
Well, thank you all for also supporting the continuance of this. And I just have one question. Will we be able to have other city staff, specifically from CDA and code enforcement, at a future meeting on this item?
Yes, we would certainly ask for the support of those staff to be asking questions further.
Thank you. That is all.
Commissioner Wu?
Yes, you ready for a motion?
No, because we actually have, correct me if I'm wrong, but according to my notes, we have to have a public hearing on this.
Okay.
And then it'll come back to the commission.
Okay, I'll wait.
All right. Then I have no further comments and questions at this point in time. Madam Secretary, have we received any written communication on this item?
We have not. No written communication.
Okay. Then do we have any of the public that at this point in time would like to make a public comment?
If you'd like to make a comment, public comment, please select the hand icon now, or if you're calling in, please dial *9. We'll wait 30 seconds to see if we have any speakers. About 10 more seconds. Okay, we do not have any speakers, Chair.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. With that, the public hearing is now closed. We'll bring it back to the commission, and I'm sure, I think we got all the questions on. Does anybody have any final questions at this point in time before we make a motion? Okay, hearing none, then would anybody like to make a motion with regards to this zoning ordinance 2021-02?
Mr. Chair, I'd like to continue this discussion to the next meeting
Okay,
and to have a more comprehensive staff presentation and discussion with the commission on it.
okay,
If I may ask respectfully, staff is signaling that they would need an additional 30 days. So if you can continue this to the meeting of May 24th?
To May
Yes.
24th, yes. I modified to May 24th.
Thank you.
thank you, Min, thank you, Commissioner Wu. Do we have a second to that continuance?
I would like to second that, but I have a question for staff.
Go ahead.
Because staff would like a 30-day continuance, is there an opportunity there to have a study session on the item at our next meeting?
I think there's no harm in having a study session. However, based on the questions that I have today, were there any additional questions that the commission would like to ask, or any other issues that you want to explore that can't otherwise be addressed based on your questions and discussion from tonight?
So for Commissioner Alderetti, what I would say is I might have more questions once I have a better understanding of what we're trying to accomplish with these edits to the code. So that's really why I kind of brought a study session up, because we've done that in the past for, say, complicated items.
So a study session can be accomplished, and it's something that staff can put on. It doesn't necessarily have to be a continuance of that. You can still continue it for 30 days and ask for a work study session at the following meeting, at the next meeting.
Let me just qualify something here, Min. We started out possibly bringing this back to the next meeting, and now based on your staff's statements, we brought it back to May 24th, which is a month away.
Correct.
So, maybe not next meeting, but possibly the meeting afterwards. Is that the meeting that would be a work study? Is there a way we can do a work study? Is next meeting possible, or is it the second meeting?
The continuance, the original request for continuance would be for 30 days, so we can bring back an ordinance that is going to address some of your questions, all of your questions tonight, and the concerns and nuances that has been expressed, and also provide us with a opportunity for reporting back and with a further clarification and a discussion on your questions and the recommendation as well. So the goal in the 30 days continuance is to have an ordinance that you could consider for recommendations to the city council.
So, and I just go back and look at the calendar myself and say it's not going to work on the 24th anyway, because that's when you're going to do your second report. So again, the next meeting, is that possible that we can have a work study, or is it something that we need to have a work study outside as a special meeting, not just part of the existing regular meetings?
So we can have one options, and Mr. Attorney, if you want to assist me with this, is we can do it as a part of a study session, or as the chair, I believe you have the opportunity to have an ad hoc discussion on this with commissioners that you would want to post. So those are some options that you have.
I would like to discourage an ad hoc discussion, because then it wouldn't be a public discussion. And I think this is an important issue that the public needs to have access to at all meetings.
Okay. So how do we resolve what we're going to do with regards to providing feedback and review of the documentation before the 24th of May?
What we could do is that if you provide directions to us, what we could provide at the next meeting, there could be a work study session, I guess, if you want to call it, at the next meeting, and have the continuance of the public hearing to the 30 days continuance.
So you would have a work study for the meeting on the 12th of 10th or 12th of 10th of
May 10th.
May 10th.
Yes.
So I think that there's some interaction that's being requested here, not just with those that are here tonight, but those that could possibly contribute to this. Call it, code enforcement or any other organization that ties out with this kind of ordinance. We've given you a lot of information, but it appears that there's more information that people want to have. So I guess the statement is the 10th is when we would have a work study. But if you want to gather more information, if any of us want to gather any more information and put it forward to you, when do we have to get that to you to help with the work study?
It would be at least, we would like at least a week to be able to do some research if it's additional information we'll need to get to. But I think a week, by next week would be, a week before the meeting would be.
And then we still, go ahead. Commissioner Ramos?
Yeah, I had a quick question. Well, does the next meeting provide enough time for staff? I also want to be conscious of staff and staff capacity. And if staff wanted more time.
The time was for the preparation of the report because we do have a process, but yes, the next meeting would be adequate for the study session. If you can provide us any additional questions you may have, in addition to the one we have already taken notes of tonight.
Okay. And then
perhaps the study session could focus on the issue brought up at this meeting and to see what you have come up with by then and what you are proposing to put in the one on the 24th. And I take it that the session on May 10th will be open to the public for that study session.
All study session would be, the public can be viewing like they would be here tonight.
Yeah, maybe that will work.
And I do, sorry, one last thing. I do have something else that I would ask for staff to consider. I'm wondering how this ordinance would interact with the housing element update.
Sure.
And what implications have.
Okay. Any other comments on?
Yeah, in response to Commissioner, the question posed to Commissioner about the procedural, next steps procedurally, I think that would really just depend on what the commission is in soliciting the additional information that has been discussed tonight. To the extent that the commission feels it needs a study session to deduce that information, say in a more granular fashion, then it may wish to propose a study session. To the extent the questions have been posed to staff, and I know staff has taken detail, to the extent the commission feels that staff is equipped with what it needs to return with a modified version of the ordinance in response to its, then that may be sufficient by itself. But I think in response to the questions posed to Commissioner Executive Director Tai about the next steps, I think it really depends on just what amount of information the commission is seeking.
Okay.
Can I move forward with my, well, I don't know if Commissioner Wu now needs to amend his motion.
I think the best course to do is for me to withdraw my motion and for my second to withdraw to place a new motion in place. It would be simpler. Okay. Or if you prefer, Chair Mark, I could modify it.
Put forth your motion that you'd like to do at this time.
Okay, I propose that we have a study session on May 10th to address specifically some of the issue brought up by the commissioner at this meeting regarding the new ordinance and anything that comes to them between now and the meeting, and that would be a public meeting. And then on the 24th, we will review the new proposed ordinance that they will be sending to City Council.
Okay, then thank you for the motion. Who would anyone like to second that motion?
I'll second.
Commissioner Ramos is seconding the motion.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Is 2 weeks enough time after the study session to formulate the for staff to formulate the revised ordinance?
The answer is yes, and if you need more time, you can also ask for more time on the 24th.
Okay. All right. So we have a motion from Commissioner Wu. We have a second from Commissioner Ramos. Any other questions of staff? Hearing none. Madam Secretary, will you give a roll call vote?
Yes, roll call vote. Commissioner Alderete.
Yes.
Commissioner Calderon.
Aye.
Vice Chair Morrissey.
Aye.
Commissioner Pham.
Aye.
Commissioner Ramos.
Aye.
Commissioner Wu.
Aye.
And Chair McLaughlin.
Aye.
Motion passes by majority vote.
Thank you, Madam
I'm sorry, by
Secretary.
unanimous vote.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Okay. Now this concludes the public hearings at this point in time. We will move to the business calendar. Item number 6 is the commission discussion regarding call for election of the office of the chairperson. Min, will you provide a overview here?
Thank you, Chairperson. This item was a request of the Planning Commissioner at the last meeting for the City Planning Commission to consider the discussion about the call for an election of the chairperson. The review of the request, we have recommendation within the staff report that for the commission tonight to discuss that request. And if the commission desire, it can exercise its authority under section 12B of the bylaws to conduct a preliminary review and potentially conduct the election of the chairperson at the next meeting. Based on the review of what took place at the meeting of April 12th, the request was for the call for the election of the chair. In our review of the bylaw and pursuant to section 11 of the commission bylaw, the election of the office of chairperson and vice chairperson are done annually in July, and in the case of a vacancy of a position. And that was precisely the reason why that we had conducted a election of the vice chair at the meeting in March to address the vacancy of Vice Chair Contreras-Leo. Because of that vacancy, that office needed to have an election taking place. As to the question of the election of the chairperson, based on our review, the chairperson selected by the commission to serve the term for the 2021 term was continuous. As you know, the chair office is currently being occupied by Commissioner McLaughlin. He has continuously served uninterrupted at the Planning Commission level since his election back in August. Commissioner McLaughlin was serving as a appointment citywide representative of the City Council when in January 19th, he was appointed by the council to serve as a Representative Ward 4 in place of the representation citywide. So therefore, a vacancy under the bylaw did not occur. However, the commission, in light of the lack of any directions on whether or not an election can take place outside of the 2 instances as dictated by the bylaw, the commission can have a discussion through the authorization under section 12 of the bylaws, which allow for the commission to discuss this issue about putting on the agenda if it should have an affirmative vote of 3. The bylaw does outline a 3-step process that would, at tonight's meeting, if desired by the commission, is to have a vote, and it only requires 3 votes in the affirmative to place the discussion on for preliminary review and discussion at the following meeting, at which time the agenda can also address the election of the chair should there be a vote at the next meeting to take this issue beyond preliminary discussion. So, based on that, the commission can exercise a discussion and entertain this discussion through that process. As I mentioned, the first step would be for tonight to have a vote on whether or not to even place this matter for discussion preliminary at the May 10th meeting. And then at the May 10th meeting, should the commission desire, it would take a vote and it require a majority vote then to call for the election. And if that happens, then the commission then can take action to hold the election at that meeting as well. Again, I just want to share that this is for the discussion on the term of the chair that is remaining, and that would be through July. As you know, under the bylaw, July, there would be a new election called for under the bylaws. So that concludes my staff report, and that would be at this point in the hands of the commission as part of your discussion.
Okay, thank you, Mint. We'll go through the commissioners. Commissioner Alderete, any?
Thank you. So some of you are probably wondering why I raised this issue of election for the chairperson, and I'm doing so now only with a few months until our next election. And so the reason why I did this, there were 3 reasons. One is, hold on. The first reason is I think section 11B of the bylaws requires this result because there was a vacancy in the chairperson position when the current chairman resigned as Mayor Polito's appointment in December and then was sworn in as Councilmember Becerra's appointment on January 19th. So the commissioner, the chairman had to resign from the earlier position, which created the vacancy. Second, I felt duty bound to raise it because I believe this body ought to follow our own bylaws, which require an election at our first meeting in 2021 due to the vacancy of the chairmanship. And delaying it even for a few more months on top of the already 3-month delay, I would say is an abdication of our responsibility. Third, given that all the commissioners were newly appointed to the commission in January 2021, we and no one else should have an opportunity to choose the chairperson, just like we recently chose the vice chair. And so in sum, I'm asking that this body just follow its own rules and that we can do so by following the procedure laid out in section 12B of our bylaws and have an election vote at our next meeting. That's really all that I wanted to say on this issue.
Okay, thank you.
Now.
Commissioner Calderon,
I have nothing. Thank you.
Commissioner Vice Chair Morrissey.
Yeah, I guess, I read the language and, I read it differently, but I guess it's really a question for our legal counsel. I'm not aware that the chair actually submitted a letter of resignation, so I never saw a reason to hold an election because he never left the position of the chair. So that may be nuanced, but I was wondering what the opinion of our legal counsel is.
Yes, Commissioner Morty, thank you for the question. The interpretation that was explained and advanced by Executive Director Tai is a permissible and a reasonable interpretation of the scenario under the facts. And that is why the matter is before the commission today, as a matter not otherwise before the commission, as that term appears in section 12B of the bylaws. The bylaws do speak to the election of the offices of chair and vice chair at certain predetermined times, but they do not expressly preclude those elections at other times. And that again is why this matter is before the commission under section 12B as a matter not otherwise or ordinarily before the commission.
Okay, so the recommendation from Min was that we didn't, the explanation was that we didn't because the chair never left the position of chairman. Is that correct?
Our review of the action that, are you asking of the legal attorney? I'll let John answer that.
No, it's not, I just want to make sure I understood what your introduction was.
So based on our review of the attendance records, based on our review of any resignation requests or any communication, we did not have any resignation submitted by Chair McLaughlin. And based on our review of the city council action, there was never action to remove Commissioner McLaughlin from his position on, or his service on the planning commission. It simply went from, or not simply, but it went from serving as a citywide representative to serving as a Ward 4 representative. So his service was continuous and uninterrupted. And therefore, his election and service under the selection under the bylaw, there wasn't a vacancy.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for clarifying that.
Staff undertook that analysis, Commissioner Morrissey, in consultation with our office. And again, just to reiterate, the conclusion that was reached by staff is a permissible and a reasonable one under the circumstances.
Thank you.
Thank you, appreciate that.
Commissioner Fan.
Right, thank you. Do we anticipate this matter taking up too much of the commission's allotted time? I know these meetings don't have a time kind of stoppage, but my feeling is if it's not too much of a time-consuming matter, and if there are commissioners who feel like that there's a process that need to be kind of followed through, then if it's not too much of a inconvenience, I wouldn't object to just following through and have the results and as they will turn out, and then we can close the subject for any future discussion.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Fan. Commissioner Ramos.
Just for clarity on this item, staff would need a motion and a second, and then a commission majority to have a future election.
No, so the bylaws under section 12B lays out a 3-step process. In order for the commission at this point in time to take up this issue, it would first to take the initial step of scheduling this at the next meeting for this further discussion as a preliminary review. And that is a vote that would have to be taken tonight. And if that request receives 3 affirmative votes, that would be all that is necessary then to have it agendized as a preliminary review discussion on May 10th. And should on May 10th, the commission desires to move forward further and ask that the matter, although the call for the election take place, then would take a vote on that. And that if that received 4 votes, then you would proceed to then call for the election of the office of chairperson as a final step.
Okay,
And that would
so,
also follow the normal process by having a nomination and then an election.
so it would be a vote today of at least 3 commissioners, a vote next week of at least 4 to have an election the following. I understand that now. Thank you.
Commissioner Wu.
Yes, fact, there was no vacancy. Fact, we have an election in July. Fact, there's about 90 days left with a lot of agenda items to do. So my thinking is that why are we having a motion to go through an election process to put it on the agenda when there was no vacancy that occurred, and for which they're going to be election anyway in July. You know, I don't see why do we have to do this, and you know, I hate this kind of stuff, tell you the truth. You know, you did not vacate your office, you just transitioned from one appointed area to another. That's a representation issue. You stayed on the commission. So I'd rather move forward. I'm sorry. I do respect that we have the right by the bylaw to do this, to bring up the issue if you get 3 votes, but to even go through it and go through the issue just taints the respect that we're supposed to have for each other here. I mean, that's my opinion and you ask. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Commissioner Wu. From my standpoint, the staff and legal has rendered their decision as to whether or not there was not a continuous situation or it was a continuous situation. I think they have the information, they presented it. I just hope that we can move on from this. So at this point in time, would anybody like to make a motion on this item?
Yeah, well, I would like to make one comment. So my motion or this idea was, yeah, I disagree that there was not a vacancy. I think once you change office, there is, by the operation of law, a vacancy. You move from one office to the next. Obviously, that's not convincing to folks. I'm process oriented because that's what I do for a living. I'm a litigator. I litigate cases all the time. And there's a code of civil procedure that I have to follow, whether it's in state court or federal court. And I thought that this was, in my mind, clear cut, but I appreciate that other folks don't see it that way. So here's what I'm going to do. I'll withdraw I won't make the motion, and I'll withdraw this at this point.
Okay. Would anybody else want to make the motion? Hearing none. The issue is closed. John?
Procedurally, is there a question, Chair McLaughlin?
Yes, there's no motion. No one has made a motion. And at this point in time, we don't have a motion or a second. So the item is closed at this point in time.
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate everybody's support on this. With that, this concludes the business calendar. We'll move on to comments. Do we have any staff comments at this point in time?
I do not, sir.
You're commented out for the night?
Yes.
Okay. All right. We'll go down and do commissioners' comments. Commissioner Alderetti?
I have no comments.
Okay. Commissioner Calderon?
Thank you, everyone, for your thoughtful thoughts.
very productive meeting today. Look forward to the next meeting. Thank you.
Vice Chair Morrissey.
Yes, thank you. I do have a couple comments. One is there are some issues that are occurring possibly that are out of our control that involve environmental justice and involves our water supply. I don't know if anybody heard the Huntington Beach desalination plant is possibly close to being approved, and it could raise our water rates and have a huge impact to our the cost that residents of Santa Ana pay for water. So I think we need to consider that when we're thinking about the environmental justice portion of our general plan, which I know we're working on, but promote innovative, creative ways to structure our water supply and the way we bill for water so that we don't impact people of lower income who are, really don't have the ability to pay these higher water rates. So I think that's something we need to look very closely at. Just on that as well, I think we need to challenge ourselves to look beyond minimum requirements when we're thinking about environmental laws and requirements. It also speaks to environmental justice and challenge ourselves to find innovative policy solutions to areas that aren't currently addressed by our environmental regulations. I know just for instance, LA has some supplemental air quality restrictions for housing near freeways. I think these are things we need to consider when we're looking at putting housing near freeways. I think these are all important environmental issues we need to consider when we're thinking about environmental justice. So those are my comments. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Vice Chair Morrissey. Commissioner Fan.
Yes, I think I'd like to say thank you for everyone's candidness in all the subjects that we discussed throughout tonight. It's a bit harder to kind of get to know everyone and kind of their feelings on certain subject just kind of via every 2 weeks we get to meet. And I'm sure, once we were able to convene in person, it'll be a more personal experience. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Fan. Commissioner Ramos.
I just want to thank staff for their work and their responsiveness to the commission, specifically on item 5 and bringing back a study session. And I would also like to ask staff, whenever possible, to share the work that they're doing with other departments that might also be affected by the items that will come to this commission. I think that there are unintended consequences that can arise, and sharing information with other departments might help us identify those early on and before they come to the commission. And then lastly, I also have a question for staff. So I know that the Parks Master Plan Advisory Committee, I believe is what it's called, will have a representative from the Planning Commission. And I'm wondering when staff will bring that to the commission so that we can elect a representative.
I'm not sure if through the process, the Park Master Plan, in terms of forming the committee, is going to request for a commissioner's representation. We will certainly follow up, but I'm glad that you brought this issue up. I do have one request of the commission as a follow-up to the last meeting, is to provide us with your selection of a person to represent the commission on the housing forum that we will be hosting as part of the update of the housing element as presented by our principal planner, Melanie McCann, at the last meeting. But I will follow up to see whether or not the master park process is going to request a representation from the planning commission.
So I've actually seen the roster of those. I know other individuals that have been invited, and the planning commission is listed as a commission that will have a representative. So I'm wondering if we can discuss that at the next meeting.
We haven't requested.
Commissioner Ramos?
Yes.
I'm sorry, may I? This is Sarah Bernal. That invitation actually did go out from Lisa Rudloff, the executive director, and she did invite the chair, Mark McLaughlin, to serve on that committee. And Mark could probably provide some more information when he will be serving on the committee, but they did select him to represent the Planning Commission.
So would that be a, I guess a seat, is a seat on that committee a seat that has been designated for the chair of the commission, and similarly for the chairs of the other commissions that will be on that committee? Or, yeah.
I do believe that they did ask the chairs of each commission, but we can definitely confirm that information or verify that information and get back to you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think it would be helpful to know, just for transparency. And I don't know if Chair McLaughlin had received that invitation yet, but just so that the commission as a whole is also receiving information and is aware of what's happening. That would be great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Commissioner Wu.
I want to thank Vice Chair Morrissey for the information on the environment, justice, and the water. With that in mind, can I stop watering my lawn? and start, you know, I'd like to get rid of that English English way of living with a lawn, unless I could have goats.
Okay. Anything else, Alan?
No, you need a motion to adjourn?
No,
before you adjourn, actually, before you adjourn, if you can let me know if there's any interest on representing the commission on the housing forum.
I have interest.
Okay. Anybody else? All right. And you will you get with Commissioner Ramos as
Would
to?
you?
All right.
Would you? Thank you.
All right. Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, good. All right. With regards to the environmental justice, I'm not sure. Tom, are you aware of the meeting that's on? I think it's tomorrow evening. There is a workshop on the environmental justice.
Oh, no, I was not aware of that.
Yeah.
It's Logan.
It's Logan, correct?
Yeah,
Correct.
yeah. The staff is doing a good job of going out to the neighborhood and engaging them. And I want to really thank you for that. I've attended one session and you guys were really listening well and helping the neighborhood to process what they've done. As a follow-up, you've taken their suggestion, at least in Artesia Pilar, you expanded the area per se, and you looked at the data from the state. So it's been really an interesting, inclusive process. And there's a group working from the Santa Ana Building Healthy Community, and it was helping the resident groups as well. So,
Right. So as updated in the last meeting, we are hosting a series of meetings following up on the environmental justice issue, meeting with each of the environmental justice neighborhood in clusters. And we have at this point 10 meetings that we have planned out. Tomorrow night will be the 4th meeting, and it's going to focus on the area of Lacey, Logan, and downtown.
I do have a question with you regarding that. Since you now are looking at all the traditional barrio neighborhood that connects to each other from Logan to Santa Anita, is there a way to look at the past injustice in a way that roads and circulation and where they place industry and all that, to begin looking at how to restore them back to more residential and providing resources to help revitalize those neighborhoods, and maybe resources with that pandemic number to hire neighborhood youth to do cutting the lawn, landscaping, painting, and things like that. Is there an opportunity to kind of make that consistent? So, because if you look at the city, you have the north of 17 really nice and all that, and you have the rest of the city, right? So it's just a question that's been boggling my mind as to where can we talk about this,
I think as a commission, you will be able to discuss this when the item and the matter is before you as part of the general plan. We do take the comments, we listen to the comments, and the goal is, as you mentioned, is to develop overarching policies and objectives to either address the inequity or in some instances, addressing in a future aspect of the development process. In the realm of land use, there are many things that are set in place that may not be feasible to set a different course, but we can certainly look at the use and the land use pattern and how we address the issues as a matter of policy in the future.
Thank you.
Anything else, Alan?
No.
Okay, thank you. I'll be brief. I just want to thank everybody for the support. And we've got some great projects ahead of us, and we went through one tonight that I think has a lot of impact on the city, and being able to work through the different aspects with the workshop and everything else will benefit. Again, thank you for supporting me. And with that, I'm going to say that the next meeting will be held via teleconference on Monday, May 10th, 2021 at 5:30 p.m. And this meeting is adjourned. Thank you again.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Good night,
Good
everyone.
night, everyone.
Good night.
Bye.